Hello once again, Internet. I am Rosanix7 and I'm bringing you something a little different today. Since I'm such a huge fan of this game, it feels to me like my Let's Play didn't really do it much justice. There's just so much to talk about it, but not just the game itself, with some things behind the scenes. So, I figured it would be appropriate to end off this series officially with a short video talking about Metroid Prime 2's early days. But before that, we're going to kick things off with some basic trivia. It's a bit to go over, so I'll try to be quick. A Nintendo GameCube bundle with Metroid Prime also included a bonus disc for Echoes, featuring some trailers and a whopping 12 rooms from Temple Grounds, Agon Wastes, and Dark Agon. Despite the game telling you they were stolen, you don't actually have the power bombs and grapple beam prior to this scene. Echoes was the first game in the series to feature multiplayer, but oddly enough, the original Metroid claimed to have it as well, though it's possible this was just one of many translation errors. Speaking of which, similar to how Prime 1 featured Metroid as an unlockable, Prime 2 was going to have Super Metroid, but for whatever reason, the idea was scrapped. Echoes was the second game in the series to have spoken dialogue, the first being...
The last Metroid is in captivity.
During the flashback at the beginning of the game, you can hear a Marine speak. Lastly, there's a plot inconsistency mentioned in one of the Trooper logs, talking about how Samus blew up a planet full of space pirates. The only game this corresponds to is Super Metroid, which chronologically happens after this. Alright, now that we have all that out of the way, let's get to the interesting stuff. For starters, back in 2005, the Tokyo Game Show took place in, Tokyo, and Nintendo was scheduled to demonstrate what would later be known as the Nintendo Wii. However, one of the things they wanted to show was how the Wii Remote worked so well with shooters, but they didn't have a game ready for it. So, they turned to Retro Studios, which is interesting because the feature they wanted to push was demonstrated by a third-party game, developed by Retro instead of Nintendo themselves. This game was, of course, Metroid Prime 2. 2 months before TGS, a pile of circuits and wires showed up at Retro's door, and one guy took it upon himself to bring it to life. Mark Hutchinson, I don't know, who developed the camera system in the first Prime, spent the full 2 months converting the game to function on the Wii. Apparently this left such an impression that both Echoes and the original Metroid Prime were both individually ported to the Wii in 2009, under the name Wii de Asobu Metroid Prime. I'm not kidding, it's right there. Amazing. As for the game itself, it actually featured quite a few changes. For example, the spring ball function, which would later be brought back in Corruption for the first time in an official game, is unlocked when you first get bombs. A new normal difficulty mode has been added as well, which oddly enough is sort of a reverse Mega Man effect. It's basically an easy mode, but oddly enough, this Japan exclusive is the only game to feature it. The majority of changes are simply aesthetic, like better shadows and a slight bloom effect, as well as featuring your remote's battery life integrated into the heads-up display. There are a couple instances of changed music as well. The quick little jingle from getting the transfer module and temple keys is different, the theme played when restoring an energy controller is extended, and areas featuring Dark Metroids now play the Impact Crater theme from the first game. It's a nice touch. And, of course, all this would later inspire the release of Metroid Prime Trilogy, featuring all 3 games on one disc. It isn't being made anymore, but you could find it pretty easily online for Jesus! Okay, never mind, I'm just gonna go over here. Let's move on to the really interesting stuff, particularly what Metroid Prime 2 could have been in what now goes by Metroid 1.5. It isn't entirely clear exactly how far into development this idea was, but it's assumed to be not very far since it didn't pass concept stages. It was planned to be an immediate sequel to Prime 1, starting off with Samus leaving the atmosphere of Talon 4. She goes into cryosleep for the ride home, but her nap is rudely interrupted by a distress signal that her ship takes it upon itself to investigate. That's what you get for using cruise control. The source of the signal ends up being a huge alien ship, possibly even bigger than the bottle ship in Other M. As she approaches, a tractor beam pulls her in, just as the ship passed into a parallel dimension. Samus wakes up aboard this empty ship and finds that it's been overrun by its artificial intelligence, which has the intent of crashing into a nearby planet and enslaving the natives. Interestingly, The AI was planned to have multiple personalities who would taunt and try to trick the player as they progress. Chances are this setup sounds pretty familiar, and while I doubt there is even a remote connection, it does sound a whole lot like Portal, right down to trying to kill you with poison gas. More than likely a coincidence, but interesting nonetheless. As for the specifics of its goal, the aliens inhabiting the ship are all in suspended animation, and the AI has been traveling the universe assimilating violent and powerful entities and weapons to achieve perfection, hence the distress signal. It was also suggested that there be other bounty hunters that arrive, which could have actually been the basis for Metroid Prime hunters. The game would also feature a subversion of the typical regaining of your abilities featured in previous titles by taking a Banjo-Tooie approach, letting you keep everything from Prime 1 and having it from the beginning. The difference is, though, that you would be restricted to certain items in certain areas, forcing you to approach things in unexpected ways based on what you're allowed to use. You would also have to adjust to the world itself, seeing as being in a parallel dimension has disrupted gravity and even time in certain areas. Walking on walls, machines running backwards, etc. These mechanics, along with increased focus on scanning and the morph ball, would make the game more about puzzles and exploration than the combat the Prime series is more known for. The AI was also planned to have 4 personalities, each of which would have their own physical forms represented by holograms and would affect the gameplay style depending on which is present. Probably the most unusual of the bunch is the Mother, which would actually serve as a helper by offering upgrades and exposition. Plus, it would also pick a bounty hunter, possibly Samus included, that it would favor over the others chosen randomly from the start. It isn't made clear what effect this would have on the game, so we're left to speculate. Second is the Child, which is based more on puzzles with noticeably less combat. It would play with you by undoing things you already did, or even stopping your progress and forcing you to, quite literally, play a game with it. Keeping the theme going, these areas would be fairly well lit and warmly colored, but entering dark rooms would actually scare it. It seems like these sections would end up kind of like babysitting, except the kid is Satan. Next is the Killer. Descriptions of this one made a number of references to paint a pretty clear and admittedly kind of unsettling picture. Aside from focusing on combat with more stronger enemies, it would also try to interfere with your display to disorient you, in reference to games like Silent Hill and Eternal Darkness, right down to using dark rooms that force you to use other visors. Even stranger, its speech would have been based on Hannibal Lecter and A Clockwork Orange. Ugh. However, the most important of the bunch is the Martyr. It would serve as the final form, being what the AI was meant to become from the beginning. Its mission is to ultimately crash the ship as planned and will stop at nothing to do so, culminating to a boss fight with an insane, screaming construct with nothing to lose. The fight itself had a lot of different ideas on how exactly it was supposed to be done, possibly meaning that there could have been multiple outcomes. Enemies found in the game don't really stand out much, except for 2. First is the Shock Beast, which is cited as an alien space pirate hybrid. However, looking at the concept art, you can see that this design was actually used for the real game as just a space pirate. And that's weird, but not particularly interesting. But that doesn't compare to the appropriately but unimaginatively named u-Metroid. A Metroid essentially riding in a human-shaped shell that can detach at will, rendering the shell invisible. But the most unexpected and interesting detail about this is how it's described as player-controlled. Metroid 1.5 was planned as a co-op, similar to Portal 2 and Goof Troop. A mechanical copy called Mecha Samus would be controlled by a second player, or somewhat limitedly by player 1. On top of that, a second player could join in and leave at any time. Even more interesting is that the way it talks about multiplayer. If you've played Journey, you may be aware that you can encounter other beings like yourself throughout your adventure, and they're actually other people that just happen to be playing at the same time. Players would be advised to work together at first when they're still weak, but as they gain new abilities and get stronger, they could turn against each other. These other bounty hunters were also planned to be unique in their design and abilities, with the only constant being an equivalent of the morph ball. It's right here that we can clearly see these elements have been carried over into hunters. Going further into multiplayer ideas, it specifies how bosses would have been designed around multiple characters with unique abilities, having more than one way to defeat them. On top of that, it mentions a new mode where defeating a boss would unlock them in said mode, wherein the player can actually control the boss themselves against a team of other players. There are some others listed, but it's safe to say that this one takes the cake. I mean, imagine taking control of Kraid, launching spikes and swinging around giant claws while a tiny group of pixels runs around your feet. Also, morphball bumper cars. Yes. Getting back to the game itself, along with some fancy new melee attacks, the item system was going to get a small but incredibly significant change. Acquiring new items and upgrades in the game would require the AI downloading some of your genetic material, giving enemies some of your abilities, making it a question of whether or not you want this missile tank in exchange for making your enemies even stronger. Although these abilities included things like invisibility and walking on walls, so whether or not leaving some of these things behind is actually a viable strategy is kinda debatable. We would have to see exactly how it was implemented. All in all, this would definitely have been a different experience than what we've seen from the series so far, but it wasn't supposed to be the same. Honestly, if executed well, I bet it would have been great. There's so many new ideas here to change up the formula just enough to stay faithful, but introduce something fresh at the same time. I can't really say that this would have been a better game than what we got, since there's no real way to tell unless it actually gets made. If nothing else, it makes for a great story of what could have been. And now, before I end things off here, I actually have a little announcement. Starting November on at 8 p.m. every I'm going to be doing a live playthrough of Metroid Other M. You'll be able to find the playthrough at www.twitch.tv/RosanX7. The link is right on screen now and into the description. And blah, 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 blah. Can you tell I've gone off script now? Because I have. I am going to be recording it as usual, and it may be a live playthrough, but I'm still going to do my best to treat it like a regular Let's Play. And I'm probably going to have a couple guest commentators as the series goes on as well. And don't worry if you miss it and still want to see it, I am going to be recording it at the same time. I'm going to edit it a little bit when I get around to it, and it will be posted. So if you're interested, then follow the link there. You can add me to your watch list, and that'll tell you whenever I post a thing. And you can come watch it. It'll be grand fun. And hopefully I will see you guys then.